You're listening to Engineers, the podcast, where founders and operators share firsthand knowledge on how to build and scale startups. I'm your host, Oleg Kuchikov, and our guest today is Puneet Arora, the founder of Ekline, an AI platform for user documentation. Today, we're discussing the role generative AI can play in creating external user-facing documents. But before we get into that, I have to welcome Puneet to the show. Puneet, welcome. Where are you joining us from today?
Thank you, Oleg. So glad to be here. I'm from Bay Area. I'm in Sunnyvale at my home office.
Wonderful. I love Sunnyvale. Was probably there last week, actually. Not that anyone needs to know or care about that, but it's like the name sounds. It's a beautiful place to be. All right, well, let's get this thing started. Let's kind of unpack a little bit about your background and inspiration for starting Ekline. So you spent some significant time as a senior engineer and then an engineering manager at Atlassian, a company I'm sure a lot of engineers are familiar with. Can you tell us just how you ended up there?
Oh, interesting story. I was actually working at an early stage startup in New York, and I was never planning to come to the Bay, but somehow my wife, my girlfriend back then was like, "Hey, Puneet, just go and do the interview." And I ended up doing that, and I ended up selecting Atlassian, and it just all happened so quickly. I think I did my interview on Friday, and by Sunday I had already signed the offer. So Atlassian was kind of not on my radar, but I'm really glad that it actually happened. So I've spent there about 8 years. It's a lifetime in tech, but really enjoyed every bit of it. Learned a lot.
I'm still curious to learn a little bit more, like what kind of projects were you working on when you started and then kind of down the line?
So I started my journey with a marketplace, Atlassian Marketplace, an ecosystem. As an engineer, learned a lot from all the amazing experienced people that I had in my team, and spent about 3 years there in Marketplace, and then moved to Confluence. Then my later half of my tenure at Atlassian for about 5 years was building Confluence. I was brought in to lead some acquisitions and some integrations of those acquisitions into Confluence, started from there. Love not only doing the engineering part, but also started to lead people, love that aspect. And since then, when I left Atlassian, I was leading Confluence AI with my amazing triad partners, my PM and design partners. Made some big, massive impact, especially in the last year with AI.
Awesome. We'll definitely get into AI today. And for those who maybe haven't used Confluence, it's like largely a product or a service for creating documentation, correct?
Yes. Confluence is for wiki, the best wiki out there.
That's a good way to put it. So how did working on Confluence kind of inspire you to create Ekline?
So Confluence is definitely an amazing product. And I feel like during my time leading engineers, I often told my engineers to actually not write documentation because documentation is going to get stale. And a lot of engineering managers or engineers would agree with me that stale documentation is better than no documentation. So I started researching on that, and I started exploring a lot of texts, talking to a lot of people, and understanding why does it get stale? Why are there no tools? Especially what is the impact of the staleness in the documentation? And that's where I realized that for a lot of companies, especially the tech companies building dev tools, the SaaS companies, documentation is the main entry point for their users, for their customers. And I started realizing a lot of the value and a lot of the effort that actually goes in keeping an up-to-date, maintained, high-quality, consistent documentation. From there, I got intrigued and I was like, okay, let me see what else is out there. And I started researching, found a lot of companies and their angles and how they were approaching to tackle staleness or maintenance of documentation, or even at platforms that allow and help enable people create easier documentation. So a lot of exploration happened, a lot of talking to technical writers happened, and that's where I started honing in, and Ekline was formed.
Excellent. Well, we're going to dive into Ekline and kind of the functionality there. I think the key takeaway for me so far is, documentation when it comes to SaaS products is kind of different than documentation when it comes to traditional products, because SaaS products are always changing, whereas something that you might manufacture, you design it once and you create the documentation, and it doesn't necessarily get stale like it might for a SaaS product. So can you kind of talk about keeping external documentation, and just in general, what's the purpose of making that commitment? Because it sounds like a lot of work.
Yes. And I would say, like, you kind of like really rightly picked, like, to be honest, in today's world, nothing is consistent, be it manufacturing. Apple is coming out of its iPhones every year, right? Google, Samsung, they are creating documentation as well. They're releasing features every day in, day out, not just on software, but on their hardware, their manufacturing. Car companies are coming out with their new releases every day. They need to create documentation on the changes in the car and a lot of others. So documentation is all around us. For the first initial direction of Ekline, we are focusing on SaaS products and dev tool companies, because they change at a much faster pace compared to doing yearly releases. Because there, the releases are likely happening by the day or by your sprints at least. The consequences of not having a good documentation directly reflects on your revenue generation. For SaaS companies and dev tools, the entry point, the top of the funnel of their users is their documentation, where engineering managers or engineers are basically looking at a company's documentation to start evaluating how the product works and is this product a good fit for them or not. Having that documentation high quality really pulls a lot more people through that sales funnel. And once I figured that, I was like, okay, like, this is very interesting and very powerful. And the teams and companies are spending a lot of money to keep the documentation up to date. How can I help streamline the workflows of technical writers, give them the productivity tools, give them the tools that can help them in their workflows seamlessly? And that's where a lot of the direction of Ekline started going in.
When you say top of the funnel, like, to me, that kind of means like marketing, I guess my question is, who should be responsible for creating the external documentation? It's kind of like a thing, but it's like going to be the engineering team's responsibility to maybe create some of this. So can you talk about that? Like, is that a challenge that people are commonly facing?
Exactly. That is the problem. That is, I believe, the root of the problem. Documentation gets stale because we try to move away the knowledge holders, the subject matter experts, from the people who are creating and writing documentation or who are responsible for maintaining the documentation. The further the gap, the higher amount of staleness will actually go into the documentation. Because people who are making changes, the engineers or the product managers, the product owners that are making changes and are familiar with the changes day in, day out, and they are the deepest subject matter expert on that topic, if they are not involved in the process of creating documentation, the further away it is from the people who are writing documentation or maintaining it, the bigger the problem area is. So it is very crucial to have them be in the loop, give them as well tools to include technical writers per se, who are amazing people and experts of creating documentation and how the information should be presented. But the tools as well need to be given to PMs and engineers so that they can do a better job in including and involving them and communicating that information.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because who should be responsible? Because it's two different jobs, right? The people that you want to make the changes and the people who you want to present the changes. It's at a certain size, like of a company. Those are two very different jobs. So it's kind of interesting to talk about these tools and these challenges of staleness. I'm curious, outside of maybe documentation going stale, which we've covered, what other challenges are businesses facing when it comes to creating and maintaining documentation?
I would say the next big challenge would be in writing the documentation and presenting the information is in the right way that is going to land well with their users and customers, is also a lot of times where companies actually fall short. And that's where I believe the technical writers come in, where they really understand the nuances of who the audience are, who the customer is. They are, in a way, they actually understand customers and their customers really, really well. They understand what information do they already have so that you are not repeating yourself, and what information do I need to provide at what moment of the user's journey. That's their art. And I feel a lot of companies actually undermine the impact that technical writers can have on creating the information architecture, and they suffer through the consequences of that, where the documentation is less consistent, the documentation is hard to follow, and the information is not flowing really well, and that in turn hurts their users and creates confusion for them.
Yeah. And what does that do for like a company's marketing efforts or their brand?
Oh, a ton. It is just gonna, as I mentioned, like top of the funnel is going to be broken now, because a lot of people are going to come to your documentation sites and will not be able to understand and probably drop off, or go to your competitors who actually have a lot better documentation and or have a community around it and be able to do and accomplish the task that they are given. Time is of the essence. So, we keep on optimizing our bounce rates of our landing pages, or page load times of our landing pages, and we emphasize on that a lot, where we are minimizing and reducing those milliseconds. And at times companies just neglect and forget about this massive SEO and marketing filled knowledge hub, the gold that they have, and don't pay much attention to it. And it can just do wonders to a company.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, everyone wants to hear and talk about AI these days. Can you give us an example of how Ekline is using artificial intelligence technology like generative AI or natural language processing?
100%. So the way we are approaching, we're kind of like doing a mix of rule-based, NLP, AI, and now generative AI. And we are trying to bring all of that together and trying to use the right tools for the right piece of job. Where using generative AI, we are helping people create the first drafts of the documentation, helping engineers who are, per se, I've been an engineer myself. I don't think I'm really good at writing English compared to a technical writer, but giving tools to engineers to help them create first drafts. A lot of times engineers or PMs might actually feel challenged by just, writing something that is going to be used by their customers, that is going to be seen by their users. And that's one place where I feel generative AI can fill in the gap really well, where now we have these LLM models that can generate content, that can generate documentation. The next job, it comes with what kind of information should actually be presented. That, I believe, is the hardest and the toughest thing. What to present and how to present that. That's where I feel technical writers really shine. We are giving tools to technical writers to take away the mundane tasks of adhering to style guides, adhering to the branding guidelines or the style writing guidelines, where a team of technical writers, by the nature of humans, we can write, we all write in different ways. We somehow have our fingerprints in our writing. But for a piece of documentation, it needs to speak as one company. It needs to come across as a very consistent and tied piece of information. And those are the tools where we are utilizing AI and rule-based engines to help provide that consistency, convert the style guides from traditional, doc-based formats to have them executable, to have them enforceable, so that the branding, marketing, terminology, how you talk about your products is very consistent, no matter who on your team is writing it, no matter if the content was written by engineers or PMs as well.
That's really interesting. And I want to follow up because when I use artificial intelligence, I tend to use the Improve My Writing tool, and I know that it'll give me kind of a consistently high quality answer, but it can give me slightly different answers every time. So can you just dive in on how does the AI assisted LLM generate consistent documentation? Because I find that every time I use it, it gives me something slightly different.
Yes, that is true. So generative AI is actually very good in creative thinking. Like you ask it a question, it can give you a response. But where it falls short is you ask it the same question 5 times, it cannot give you the same response all the 5 times. It will always have some variation, some choice of words, some way of expressing information. Now, documentation needs to be consistent and it needs to speak the language of the company, the brand voice and tone of the company. That cannot be diluted with generative AI solely. What we do is we allow companies to create style guides, to create branding guidelines in our platform. When you will log into the Ekline UI, you'll be able to create those and fine tune to the nitty gritty details of what should be my date format, what should be my definition of my product or definition, how should I actually talk about my product, what should be the capitalization cases for my products or for my brand and terminology. We allow all of that configuration to go in, and once that is done, each and every output created by the generative AI or by the LLMs that we are using will fall in line with those rules and those guidelines. That ensures no matter who is writing the documentation, either it's a human or at times AI, the documentation is consistent and at par with the guidelines.
Okay. Well, next, let's get into the benefits of using a tool like this and the target audience for it as well. Can you speak to some of the core benefits that Ekline offers to businesses and organizations?
I would say to reduce your backlog of fixing updates in documentation. That's where Ekline is really going to help. Where a lot of times when companies make these changes, those changes are not reflected in the documentation, and likely a ticket is logged in some systems and it is left for someone to pick it up someday or fix those documentation, or the technical writing team is just playing a catch-up game. That's where Ekline's writer is going to really shine, where we will be able to start helping engineers and PMs to create those first drafts, then helping in the review process of technical writers, where we're going to be adhering to the style guides. So reduction of that backlog of tickets, and keeping your documentation up to date and keeping it up with the pace of innovation and change that your company is going through. That's the problem Ekline solves.
How does it keep up with the updates and changes to the company? Because with a startup such as yours, you're going through changes like rapidly, right? Like the product might change a lot in 6 months, and after that time, you kind of have to go back and maintain all of the documents that you've created. So how does that piece work when it comes to like updating already existing documentation?
Yes, 100%. So where there are a couple of things that we allow using the tool. So one of the key aspects is we can look at, specifically for product documentation, we are integrated into Jira and GitHubs or other tools as well in future, that where the companies might actually log those tickets. As soon as the ticket is logged, we already understand the existing documentation of that company. We look at that and we start comparing to what is being told in the Jira ticket. And we try to analyze and understand the specific files or where to update that documentation. And right now we are working on a feature where it will start creating the first drafts and the first pull requests just from the description of the Jira tickets or the Confluence or the Notion pages that you have. Take that information and try to see what are the aspects of the documentation that are now going to be inconsistent, and create the first draft of update for them.
Who's your ideal target audience for in terms of users for Ekline?
Right now, we are going all in for companies building dev tools, SaaS products, and are using Doc as code approach. We are all in on Doc as code. I feel like that's probably the next. That Doc as code approach is really, really powerful. And it's probably the next big thing for documentation. So those companies that are using stuck as code, writing dev tools or SaaS companies, we can really help them.
How about the bigger companies too, like companies that have lots of existing documentation? Would you say this is for them too, or you're not focused on that market?
Yes, we are, and the big companies as well, where a lot of the documentation already exists, and they need to keep up with the change. For them, we also have another tool called Ekline Style Guide, where the companies can fine tune. For them, they really want to control what kind of language, inclusive language, gender agnostic language, the terminology, or the structure and the templates of the documentation really matter. So we have the Ekline Style Guide that can be used in their workflow, and it wouldn't matter if the documentation was created by Ekline or by technical writers or by anyone else, and they can maintain and ensure consistency using that as well.
Take us through the typical user journey. I kind of like thinking about, what does the user sort of put in, and then what do they get out, ins and outs?
Two aspects. One is the style guide, where the technical writers or the branding or the marketing teams would go in and configure their writing guidelines or their documentation guidelines, at times templates on how the how-to guides should look like, how the release notes should look like. Once they have configured all of that, no matter any kind of documentation that is being generated, we integrate into GitHub or the CI/CD pipelines and provide feedback on how much the documentation, the newly written documentation, is in line with the existing guidelines. So that's one aspect, and that's one user journey, where as soon as the pull request or the merge request gets created, the Ekline engine will provide feedback on where we are deviating from the style guide. So that's one. Then we're working on the writer aspect, where the input is what kind of change you want to make to the documentation, along with the supporting documents like the product description documents or feature release documents or any other meeting notes that you have. You kind of provide all of that to the Ekline writer, and it goes ahead and analyzes those documents, try to understand what are all the different pieces of documentation you already have and where it might be inconsistent. Either it tries to flag those inconsistencies and be like, hey, here are the places that you need to update, or at times it would even go ahead and provide the first draft of the update.
Gotcha. So it can create first drafts as well. I was kind of curious because you mentioned you give it, the existing documentation, but I'm just imagining if I was creating the minimum viable product and I haven't done any documentation yet, it can also create something from scratch.
Yes.
Can you share any success stories or case studies of how Ekline has helped companies improve their documentation processes?
100%. We are partners with Platform OS. They along with DevRev, both of them have actually been using the Ekline first products. Platform OS has received a lot of accolades on their documentation for just their developer portal. Recently, they released their new DocsKit platform, which I feel is very appropriate, and Ekline as a partner, so that all the companies who are going to be creating documentation on DocsKit could utilize the AI assistance from Ekline. So they have been really happy and really, really excited about the first version of the product. They are primarily using it for the style guides and adherence to style guides to start with. And they have seen around 30 to 40% productivity increase and velocity increases in their workflow.
Are they asking for anything more from Ekline?
100%. That's what we are working on for our next products, for our next feature set. Definitely a lot of improvements still need to be made to the platform in terms of style guides. Now we have kind of started to work on code syntax checks, image checks, a lot of the API guideline checks as well. So that's a lot more in progress for the style guides aspect. And then we are also helping out engineers and PMs to provide that information and allowing them to create the first drafts using the help of LLMs. So those are the two things that we are working on.
Awesome. Well, now that we're talking about sort of the future of Ekline, I want to ask, why is now the right time for this technology?
Great question. I often think about this. One of the big things is with generative AI, to be honest, this problem already existed. The problem of having a consistent documentation already existed. There are a lot of guidelines, like Google has its own guideline, Microsoft has its own guidelines. Now with generative AI, everyone in the company is creating content, is creating documentation that can go to the users. Where we have solved the creation aspect, we haven't yet solved the maintenance or the consistency aspect of that content. Now, creation is a lot more faster with generative AI. Everyone can just write in some prompts and, there's going to be some piece of content. Great. But that doesn't fall in line with the company's brand and voice and tone and how do they want to communicate with their users. They want to use gender inclusive language. They don't want to come across as some really older companies who don't care about the new changes in the culture and diversity. So they really want to appeal to the users, and they want that content to be the company's voice. In order to have that layer, that's where I believe now is the best time for Ekline, because with generative AI, we have solved the creation. The maintenance and the review is still remaining. That's what we are solving.
Let's look even further. How do you see the future of AI-powered documentation, creation, and management evolving? And maybe where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
A couple of months ago, I basically was just whiteboarding, and I came to this concept of zero docs. And what I kind of realized is that now we are creating documentation through AI, right? A lot of people are just creating documentation through AI. On the same hand, we also have AI consuming that documentation, where we have chatbots that are basically reading all the documentation written and providing answers to the users. In this whole process, what we are doing is we have some code or some representation of the functionality. Some really code is probably, I believe, the zero's truth of what is going to happen. We use AI to create documentation and intermediate layer. And from the documentation, we use AI to consume that documentation and give answers to the users. So we are connecting code to users. That's what we are doing. I definitely foresee a future where we will remove this middle documentation aspect and somehow really allow our users to communicate with code. And that's what I, when I think about it, and I call it as zero documentation, where the AI, the middle layer, will basically understand the code, create some internal representations for itself, and then answer the users' queries using that representation. I definitely believe that's probably at least 4 or 5 years away at the least, with the pace of change that has happened. Maybe if you would have asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have probably said at least 10 years or 15 years. But now with the pace of the change, it's probably just 4 or 5 years away from us to even not have this thing incomprehensible or see it in production. Right now, I haven't seen much of this in production. I definitely see a lot of strides being made from GitHub Copilot, where it's generating code, where it's generating documentation for code, but I feel it's still not at that higher level to be able to make sense of what the user experience is going to be like and how can the user go from one page to the other just by reading code. I don't think that's far, though. It's probably 5 or 6 years down the line, 4 to 5 years down the line.
That's really exciting, and thanks for sharing. But I wanted to get to some founder questions before we get out of here, so let's move on. Okay, early founder questions. You've been at this pretty recently, right? When did you start Ekline?
Yeah, officially 3 months ago. But the idea and a lot of the market research or explorations had been going on for quite some time.
Sure. So I guess as a founder of 3 months, technically, with some homework before that, what's your biggest learning or takeaway so far?
Biggest learning. One thing that I actually realized was talking. I just cannot ever stop talking to my customers and my users. The day I stop that, I feel like it's going to be a downhill for me in terms of being able to see that vision. What I've realized is that people often ask like, "Oh, what's your 5-year vision?" To be honest, I have no idea what my 5-year vision is because it's changing by the hour, by the day, by the conversations I'm having with my users, and I'm really enjoying this process. And I feel that's my biggest learning as well. Till the time I continue doing that and I continue refining my 5-year vision or my 10-year vision with the feedback that I'm receiving from my users, I think I should be good.
Kind of on the flip side of that, what was one or some of the biggest challenges you faced during this initial 3 months, and how did you overcome it?
I don't think that I've overcome it, but the biggest challenge I am facing is I'm a solo founder. I'm definitely talking to a couple of other people for co-founders to join me as a co-founder. One of the biggest challenges it's loneliness. I at times feel there are like so many highs and low moments. You have a good customer meeting, great, you're on the high, you're on top of the world, you have figured it out, you're going IPO, right? And you have a bad customer meeting, you have no idea what you're doing. Why did you even leave your job? Right? Those big highs and lows, I feel, are really challenging, and I'm finding it really hard, to be honest. I feel like at times I go into my own headspace and my own bubble. I really want someone to come in and burst that bubble and be like, "Puneet, what you are thinking about is total bullshit. It is all in your head and it doesn't make any sense." And I feel I really long for that. I've worked in teams, and Atlassian being one of the biggest proponents of teams and creating that culture of team, I actually value my team a lot more now. I really wish that very soon I want to just have that team, have that sounding board, have that safety net where I'm able to express and share a lot of the apprehensions and confusions and doubts about myself, about the company, and still feel supported and safe where people are going to help me see that and clear out that vision. That's what I'm looking for. And I don't think that I've solved it yet. Talking to a couple of co-founders and hoping to solve that soon.
Yeah, so big swings. I totally get that. How about, so we've talked about some advice to founders. That was great. How about for the younger engineers out there? You had, like you said, 8 years is a lifetime of working in tech, working out at a bigger company. What's something that worked for you in your career as a younger engineer?
One of the biggest things that I feel luckily I did right was to actually not join a big company in the early stage of my career. I joined a very early stage startup called Instigator. Right, I think I did an internship there. I was the first engineer to be hired as an intern. I feel the 3 years or 3.5 years when I worked with that startup in New York, a lot of learning happened. I could probably compare that learning to, 6 to 7 years of working in a big company, where in a startup you are learning a lot of aspects, especially on engineering. You are not focused on one single thing. Okay, I'm working on Java, or I'm working on this company's big infrastructure project for 2 years, but you're doing a lot of smaller things. I felt that experience gave me kind of like a generalist engineering mindset where I felt comfortable in diving into any piece of tech. I wasn't afraid of diving into front end or back end or functional programming or database optimizations or infrastructure creation, because those first 3 or 4 founding years, I had done a lot of it. I had done logging systems, a lot of different aspects. That's what I feel worked really well for me, and I recommend it to all my friends and a lot of people that seek advice, or I want to see them successful. So that would be one piece of advice.
That's really interesting. I wonder, just a quick follow-up, like, does the order of operations matter? You spent some time at a big company, you spent some time at a startup. Was it important to be at the startup first, or do you think it could go in the other order? And also, do you think it's kind of like a personality thing for you personally?
True. It may be a personality thing. I feel if I would have done it the other way around, I feel like it would have been so hard for me to go back to a startup after Atlassian spoiling me. To be honest, like big companies, like a lot of similar to Atlassian, right? There is a lot of safety net built around you, right? There are definitely a lot better compensation that you receive in a big company, right? You work on very, very complex things. You work on really high scalability and performance challenges, which are really complex. After that, I feel like I would have really struggled to go back to a startup and let go of a lot of the processes and struggle on, getting something to work from 0 to 1. That struggle, I feel, rarely gets to experience in a big company. And for me, if I would have reversed the order, I doubt that I would have gone to a startup. To be honest, I actually doubt that I would have started a company now. I feel like that order in my life played a big role to where I am today, and feeling confident of starting my own company. That order was very important for me.
This was excellent. Let's get out of here. Before we do, and again, I really like those answers. Yeah, what do you have to ask for the listener?
I think one of the things is, I feel, really learn about who you are as a person and what kind of traits you have that can work to your advantage. Lead with that passion. That, I believe, is the most important thing for anyone, no matter, be it starting a company or being an amazing engineer, being an amazing product manager. That passion and leading with that passion, that would be one ask. Like, if you can do nothing else but have that passion and the right attitude, have that in the jobs or in the work that you are doing, bring that to your jobs and you'll be successful.
And we'll finish the podcast there, because what else is there to say? If you liked our show, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and leave us a rating, 5 stars, please. To learn more about Angelneers, visit angelneers.com. Thank you to our chief Angelneer for producing and editing the show. And thank you, Puneet, for joining us, and best of luck on your startup journey.
Thank you, Oleg. Really enjoyed this.